বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা।
Hello everyone, welcome to the Hindu analysis for 20th May 2021. Let us begin with the first article today. COVID-19 affected should defer shots by 3 months. So currently we have a vaccination policy for people who haven't been infected with COVID-19. But what is the case with people who tested positive and recovered from COVID-19 successfully? Now, the Ministry of Health has came out with certain specifications and standards to ensure that people who recovered from COVID-19 successfully will also be vaccinated, albeit with a delay. Now, the ministry has said that the vaccination should be deferred by 3 months after recovery in individuals having lab test proven SARS-2 COVID-19 illness. This is a step towards addressing the issue or the lack of clarity on the fact whether if a person who had tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, should they be vaccinated or should they be given more time because their body has already antibodies over or against COVID-19. The ministry said that they have constituted a national expert group on vaccine administration for COVID, and these committee gave recommendations as to what protocol should be followed during this situation or case. The committee said that the vaccination should be deferred by 3 months from the date of discharge from the hospital in case of a COVID-19 positive patient who has recovered from COVID-19. Now, these recommendations have been based on evolving situation of COVID-19 pandemic and emerging global scientific evidence and experience. One thing can be said here is there is a shortage of vaccines in India. So the question rises, should the vaccines or the vaccine administration be done at a priority basis to people who haven't been affected by COVID-19, or it should be an uniform policy? Since there is a larger scientific evidence existing out there from various institutions around the world, implying that people who tested positive for COVID-19 and recovered from COVID-19 display or exhibit antibody response in their body against COVID-19 for at least 3 to 8 months post recovery, this makes a lot of sense to delay their vaccination at least for a period of 3 to 6 months. This is a positive step towards vaccinating India because the government has clearly realized a trend to which it is modeling or morphing its vaccination policy. So this is the policy in case of vaccine policy, that is in the case of a person testing positive for COVID-19 and then recovering possessing antibodies for SARS-CoV virus. Then what about the people having other serious illnesses requiring ICU hospitalization or ICU care? The government also suggested that these patients be held back for a period of 4 to 8 weeks before getting the COVID-19 vaccine. As of now, there are no certain or pre-existing requirements for screening of vaccine recipients by rapid antigen test before vaccination, that is. And also we have to consider what is the situation in the case of a pregnant woman. Right now, the matter of vaccination of pregnant women is under consideration and discussion, but the National Technical Advisory Group on Immunization, which was set up by the Government of India to study all these conditions, as such we call it, they haven't come out with any concrete report to either for the vaccination of pregnant women or foregoing the vaccination of pregnant women. But the reality of the situation is, as of now, we are seeing positive cases in pregnant women. In certain cases, this has led to the death of the woman and the child she is carrying. So it seems like there is a bit of communication delay or a certain delay from this technical advisor group formalizing a policy on vaccination in regards to pregnant women. Now, what about the case of blood donation? There is a lot of questions rising out of blood donation drives in regards to should a person donate blood post vaccination or not. The conventional wisdom dictates that a person who receives vaccination, that is COVID-19 vaccine, may or may not be, in certain cases cannot, donate blood for at least a month or 2 months. This has led to a lot of wide-scale shortage of blood available in blood banks all around India. So, the government and various other NGOs have been requesting people to donate blood in advance to their vaccination appointment, so that there is some sort of buffer stock kind of a situation, so that people blood banks do not run out of blood and patients do not die because they didn't receive enough blood in the case of emergencies. Moving to the next article, scrap new privacy policy, Center tells WhatsApp. So you are very well aware that there is a case going on in Delhi High Court in regards to WhatsApp privacy policy. The Indian government had submitted a petition or a response to Delhi High Court's request stating that whatever the privacy policy that the WhatsApp group is bringing into India as of May 15th is against the IT rules and termed it as illegal. On its part, the WhatsApp company, which is represented by Kapil Sibal, clearly stated that these privacy policies do not violate Indian IT laws. We are not going to withdraw our privacy policy. The only way out of this privacy policy is to stop using WhatsApp altogether. To rejog your memory, the WhatsApp privacy policy standards is a double standard. In the case of European countries, the same policy was rolled out to European citizens, but in Europe, the citizens were given a choice to whether opt in to the privacy policy or opt out of privacy policy. Irrespective of their choices, they can enjoy the full features of WhatsApp messaging services. The same privacy policy was introduced in India without the option to opt in or opt out. We were being shoved down with this privacy policy. Now, the Ministry of Electronics and IT has clearly sent a notice to WhatsApp asking it to withdraw the controversial update to its privacy policy and has sought a response from the company within 7 days. Remember, this is the same ministry that had sent a letter to the Chief Executive Officer of Facebook and Chief Executive of WhatsApp asking them an explanation on the new privacy policy. To this day, both of those people haven't responded to that request. We have to wait and see what will WhatsApp do in this scenario, because it seems that the government has drawn a line in the sand and saying that whatever you are doing is illegal according to Indian law. We are giving you ample time to coordinate with us and come up with a solution, but every time we gave you the choice for a compromise, you have been pushing it or setting it aside. Now, the Ministry of Electronics and IT notice clearly dictates that or directs WhatsApp to withdraw its Privacy Policy 2021, as the changes and the manner of introducing these changes undermine the sacrosanct values of informational privacy and data security and user choice for Indian users and harms the rights and interests of Indian citizens. Now, all this is to say for whatever the privacy policy that you are bringing in or shoving down the throats of Indian citizens is illegal. You have two options. One, withdraw it irrevocably, or face legal action. So, this is the government of India tussling with a software or a technology or a social media firm based out of United States. We have to wait, because whatever the steps that the government of India will take in this scenario will have far-reaching effects in terms of how Indian government intends to control is the wrong word, but engage with other social media platforms, particularly the case of Twitter and Facebook, where both these platforms were being accused and are being accused currently in meddling with elections all around the world. So this is an interesting turn of events, and as I said earlier, this will have an interesting outcome. As far as the legality of the privacy policy is concerned, the company is well within its rights to bring out a privacy policy. The question arises whether the privacy policy clashes with the Indian IT laws. Here is where the grey area lies. Whatever the IT policy that we have right now is a little bit of an outdated one. So, there are certain grey areas in the IT laws where this privacy policy is legal, but at the core of the IT law, this privacy policy can be termed as illegal. That is what the understanding that I got from reading the act and understanding the privacy policy that was being brought by WhatsApp. So, as far as the legality is concerned, again we have to wait for the interpretation of the Honorable High Court. Coming to the next article, or particularly in this case the editorial, interpretations which impede a just social order. I found this editorial interesting because on two fronts. One, it questions who has the authority to decide whether a community is backward. Does the power lie in the hands of the central government or in the hands of state government? As far as the article is concerned, it has a lot of opinions in it, but it also has a lot of legal facts that are intertwined with it. So let us understand what is the case in the here. First, on May 5th, the Supreme Court of India declared as unconstitutional a Maratha law which provided for reservation to the Maratha community. So, the backstory here to this is, the Maharashtra government decided to bring in a certain percentage of reservation to the Maratha community that resides in Maharashtra under the aegis or under the banner of backward class. When this law was brought in, it clearly overshot the 50% limit that was set for reservations by the constitutional bench in an earlier case. So immediately, or as inevitably, the case was placed in front of a 5-bench Supreme Court bench. Now, out of the 5, 4 wrote separate opinions, from which 3 preliminary findings were taken out. Now, in the case of the Marathwada reservation for backward class, the court observed that the Maratha community which the reservation is being awarded to did not constitutionally constitute a socially and educationally backward class. On the second front, the judges discovered that the law was in breach of a rule previously set by the court disallowing reservations made in excess of 50% of total available positions. As I said earlier, it did cross the limit of 50% threshold in the case of reservations. Third, on these findings, 2 judges on the bench dissented. The court held that the state governments had no independent power to declare a group as a backward class. This is where my question comes in. Who has the power to declare a community or a group of people as a backward class? Does the power lie in the state government or in the central government? Going by this judgment, it clearly shows that the power does not lie in the hands of state government. That is according to 2 judges from a 5-bench judge. The later 2 findings run sharply against the values of equality and federalism. So here he is comparing to the idea that the idea that these two judges held or hold in regards to the state powers is against the spirit of equality and federalism awarded or functioned under the Constitution of India. So the idea that reservation ought to be restricted to 50% does not stem from the Constitution. Yes, there is no certain limitation on reservations in the Constitutions enshrined as such. The text of Article 16.4 and 15.4, which confer power on the government to make reservations, contains no such limitations. There are no certain limitations set on the percentage of reservations under the Constitution of India. But these clauses, as seen by the Supreme Court as exceptions to a broad rule of formal equality that was thought to be envisioned or envisaged by the Constitution, and in order to protect that from the eyes of the courts, to protect this concept or idea that was envisioned in the Constitution, the courts held that, and to allow reservation in excess of 50% would lead to an exception overriding a rule. So when you look at it from the point of the courts, this idea that they hold that it should not, the reservation shouldn't exceed 50% is also a valid point. But a 7-judge bench in the case of State of Kerala versus M.N. Thomas in the year 1975, they conclusively put an end to that theory, because there the court held that a program of reservation was inherent in the Constitution's basic guarantee of equal treatment, and that affirmative action by the state was compelled by an objective of attaining substantive equality. With that, the ruling requiring the reservations do stay under 50% ought to have been deemed incongruous. So, when the court sat as a 9-bench judge in Indira Swahani versus Union of India case in the year 1992, it sustained a paradox, meaning during the deliberations of the case, they had a paradox at their hands. The majority on the bench ruled on the one hand that M.N. Thomas was correct in seeing reservation as an embedded in the constitutional vision of substantial equality, and on the other hand that reservation made in excess of 50% barring exceptional circumstances were harmful to the very idea of that vision. So even when the Thomas case, State of Kerala versus M.N. Thomas case was observed, again during the Indira Swahani versus Union of India case, majority of the judges in that constitutional bench agreed with the principles or theories put forth in the case of N.M. Thomas, because they even agreed that yes, reservations made in excess of 50% do kind of put the whole idea of having the substantive equality that is embedded in the Constitution under threat. So now again in the case of Marathwada reservation or the 50 reservation for the Maratha community in Maharashtra, there is a lot of duality or dichotomy in the observations made by the constitutional bench when the 50% limit was set in. So what is the current standing or what is the direct impact of these limitations set in by the constitutional bench regarding the limitations in Supreme Court? Now, these limitations that were set in earlier cases made the court's present ruling on the power of state governments to declare groups as backwards under court's purview or overall confusion. Until now, the case has been that the central government and each of the state governments produced separate lists declaring communities as socially and economically backward. They used to maintain separate lists, but there was some sort of convergence in understanding that this is our list, this is your list, but we'll find a common ground and work around it. Now, when the central government and the state government are on the same page, then there is no issues. But what is the situation if the central governments and state governments are not on the same list in terms of declaring communities or groups as backward classes? Following the Supreme Court judgment in Indira Swahani case, the determination of backward class was made by National Commission for Backward Classes at the level of center and by the regional commissions at the level of state governments. As a result, backward communities that were kept out of the central list were entitled to reservation at least for those posts and seats under the control of state government. This is how they found a way of compromising. When the state governments had the compulsion to add certain groups in the backward class communities, they had the option to do so for at least in the case of state governments or state government jobs, because they had control over it. And the National Commission, as they couldn't control the National Commission, but they had the regional commissions, that is regional backward commissions, through which they used to get what they wanted. For example, 20 different groups categorized as backward in Tamil Nadu do not find a place in central list. This is just one state. There are abundant examples available in other states also. One, the question is, who has the right to declare a group as a backward class? Through Indira Swahani judgment, they found a compromise. So, the job to determine which community is a backward class community was made by the National Commission for Backward Classes. This is in regards to central government. The same is done by regional commissions at the level of state governments. That is how they kind of found a synergy in their differences or lack of clarity over who has the authority. Now, this division in power, which gave state governments autonomy to classify groups as backward, stood in contrast to the list of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, because in the case of those lists, the right from the constitutional inception, the power to prepare them vested solely with the union government. Yes, that is well and good in the case of backward classes, but when you compare it to the case with the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, the power through the way of constitution was vested in the hands of central government. Now, the Supreme Court has now held that this distinction no longer holds good, because when the 102nd Amendment Act in 2018, which forms the basis for court's ruling, granted constitutional status to the National Commissions for Backward Classes. So, this kind of ended the overall dichotomy over who has the authority in declaring what. Now, in addition, it introduced Article 342A, through which it stipulated that the President of India may, after consultation with the state government, notify groups of persons within such a state who are deemed to be socially and educationally backward. Any such central list, the clause clarified, could not be altered by the Parliament, and Article 366(26)(c) was also added to this. And socially and educationally backward classes was defined as such. Backward classes are so deemed under Article 342A for the purpose of this Constitution. So again, this led to a lot of confusion and mismanagement over overall affairs, because again they are trying to redefine what constitutes as educationally or socially backward classes, and they came up with a definition and they added few more clauses and amendments to whatever that is existing, and it can be said that this led to a lot of confusion as to so these changes or amendments led to a little bit of a confusion in understanding who has the authority at the end of the day, even though the Supreme Court was very clear on that fact. So in interpreting these changes, a majority on the bench concluded that Constitution had now created a structure for determination of other backward classes identical to that place for the preparation of list of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Now, the verdict, which was controlled predominantly by Justice Ravindra Bhatt's opinion, relied on the plain meaning of Article 342A and 366(26)(c). Now, what are these two articles states? These two articles states that the power is vested in the hands of President of India, that is the Union government. Now, it overlooked at least, according to the author, it overlooked at least two essential factors. Number one, the term centralist, which is used in the Article 342A, has always been understood in contradiction to the term state list, in that it refers to categorization of groups as backward for the purpose of reservation to the posts and seats under the Union government control. Second, when state governments objected to the 102nd Amendment in the year 2018 on the grounds that their powers were being divested, meaning their powers being taken away, the Union Minister of Social Justice and Empowerment assuaged their concerns and pointed out that the proposed changes did no such thing, and the right to include or remove in the state list will remain as it is and it will not be violated in any manner. This is according to him and his statement that he made on the floors of Parliament when this amendment was being discussed and voted upon. Now, it has become an acceptable position for constitutional interpretation to hold that external aids such as parliamentary debates are useful only when plain meaning of provision is unclear. Again, the dichotomy or the confusion in terms of the term centralist according to Article 242, and as it shows that if anything, the Constitution recognizes the power of state government to frame lists of their own, any other interpretation of the term centralist would only impede on the plain meaning of the term. So, in majority's interpretation of the 102nd Amendment, though it is correct, then the changes altogether disposes states from exercising a time-honored authority. That is, they themselves creating their own list that is separate to the central list. Now again, though the minister has assuaged that the amendment wouldn't take away or impede on the powers of state government into making lists, this amendment is doing the exact opposite of what he has promised on the floors of the Parliament. So, the amendment, in the eyes of the court, did not violate the Constitution's basic structure, because according to the majority judgment given by the 5-bench judge, the alterations neither took away the very essence of federalism nor denuded the state of their effective power to legislate. But though in the eyes of the court, it didn't impede on the basic structure of federalism of the Constitution of India, it is hard to see how taking away the powers of the state governments, this critical, that is classifying the groups as backward, entitling many communities to protection under Article 15.4 and 16.4, can be seen anything but offensive to the essence of federalism. So, the interpretation of the court itself is in contrast with what the minister and the principles behind the 102 amendment seems to be. The amendment says that the power lies in the hands of the union government. The court observed it as such. But the amendment was promised on the behest that whatever the amendment is going to bring in will not have an impact on the status quo of the power share between central government, that is centralist, and the state government, that is the state list, in terms of creating their own list of communities that they deem to be economically and educationally backward. Now, do This interpretation by majority of judges in this case do give rise to certain new questions in terms of the federalism or the cooperative federalism that we hold dear to our hearts right now. Yes. Now, as of the union government side, the union government has already filed a petition to review the judgment insofar as it limits the power of state government. We have to wait and see whether the court will take up the plea or not, but understand this. The parliament amends the constitution and grants to the states an express power to determine backwardness. So, when the court's interpretation comes in the way of that amendment and law that was passed by the parliament, we have to see whether the balance that we hold in terms of Indian federalism will shift in the way of state governments or in the way of central governments. Coming to the next article, a thaw in India-Pakistan trade relations. Recently, the Pakistan government rejected a proposal made by the Economic Coordination Committee of Pakistan to import sugar, cotton and cotton yarn from India. First, the Pakistan cabinet agreed for this proposal put forth by the ECC of Pakistan, but after receiving a lot of pushback from opposition parties and other religious groups based in Pakistan, the cabinet, that is Pakistan government, went back on that proposal. Now, since 2019, both India and Pakistan took a lot of trade restrictive measures against each other, because in 2019, that is in February 2019, we had Pulwama terror attack in Kashmir. Immediate aftermath of Pulwama terror attack was the Indian Air Force carrying out airstrikes in Pakistan occupied Kashmir on terror targets. Now, after the Pulwama attack, India also withdrew the most favored nation status of Pakistan and imposed custom duties with a hike of 200% on imports. Now, later to this, though Pakistan did not react adversely to it, when India revoked Article 370, that is autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir, Pakistan suspended bilateral trade. It can be said that whatever the actions in terms of trade taken up by both the countries, that in India and Pakistan, are the strictest of restrictive measures that they undertook against each other in the past decade of relations between India and Pakistan. Now, despite the trade setback, there is a long history between India and Pakistan that shows reasons for having optimism towards reviving trade dialogue, because even though in earlier cases or in the past history or in the past, such similar trade curbs have been applied several times or several incidents, the data does suggest that after few months or few years, the resumption of trade always takes place, albeit after taking a pause. Now, the same idea or the same thing seems to be happening in the current situation also. Within months of suspending bilateral trade with India, the Pakistan government lifted the ban on import of medicines and raw materials from India as a way to avert an emerging crisis in Pakistan and ensure that there is no shortage of essential drugs to its population. On its part, India, though it imposed a duty hike of 200% on imports, it did not ban exports. Remember, this is very clear. We said that if you are going to import anything from Pakistan, they'll have a duty of around 200%. But we are not going to ban any exports into Pakistan. The 200% hike is in imports from Pakistan, but 0% duty on exports to Pakistan. Now, when this has been extensively studied, India imposed a 200 import duty hike and no ban export, but Pakistan banned both export and import from India. That is, export towards India and import from India. But when they realized that they had a crisis in pharmaceuticals, they immediately realized that the only way to come out of this crisis is to relax the import ban imposed on India in certain terms or certain items. So effectively, both India and Pakistan created a list of items that they trade in. So when the data is calculated for the financial year of 2021, a sizable number of items have been traded between the two countries. What are those items? So during 2021 and 2020-2021, that is April to February, a record bilateral trade of around $280 million was done between India and Pakistan, out of which India's export to Pakistan were $278 million and the imports were $2 million. It means what? Pakistan has been importing items worth $280 million from India, and India has been importing items worth $2 million from Pakistan. And out of the $280 million, 77% of Indian export comprised vaccines, pharmaceutical products, and products of chemical and allied industries. As I said earlier, the government of Pakistan realized that they have a crisis in their hand, and they realized that the only way to avert this medical emergency or medical crisis is to relax import curbs on pharmaceutical items emanating out of India. Now, despite the ban on trade of sugar, we have been already seeing export of sugar to Pakistan, which is the second most important item out of the 280 million exports to Pakistan. One is occupied by pharmaceutical items. The second is occupied by sugar, which accounted for 15% of India's total export. And we have also data suggesting that the most important item that is being imported from Pakistan are dates, which accounted for 31% of total imports, followed by ethyl alcohol, which accounted for 17% of total imports. They were importing pharmaceutical raw materials, vaccines, etc., etc. They were importing sugar. We were importing dates and ethyl alcohol. So to give you a little bit of backstory here, when the UPA government was in power, in order to engage with the Pakistan army and the Pakistani government, the Indian government during that period constituted an expert committee. So the committee was given the job to find all the industries that the Pakistan army had interest in. So the committee was formed on the basis that India will grant the most favored nation status to Pakistan, and Pakistan will grant the most favored nation status to India. They wanted to engage Pakistan in economic trade. They wanted to engage Pakistan economically. They said, whatever the talks regarding Jammu and Kashmir terrorism, we'll hold that to the next meeting. In this meeting, we are going to discuss about how we can integrate both of these countries economically. So the committee that was constituted during this period, they came out with a very intelligent solution to incentivize the Pakistan army. Remember, our neighbor, whether you agree or not, is controlled by the Pakistan army. So the committee that was constituted came out with this very ingenious plan, and they came out with a list of companies either that are owned by Pakistan army or individuals who are in power in Pakistan army. This committee said that the Indian government will actively engage in the businesses that are being controlled by the Pakistan army. So what is the implication here? The implication here is that when India engages with the entities that are owned by Pakistan army or individuals in power in Pakistan army and in Pakistan government, they have an incentive. They have an need to have a better relationship in Pakistan so that they can earn profits with trade with India. So the committee came with this ingenious idea to incentivize the people in power in an economical way so that they can get rich and they can work or strive to maintain a balance in relationship between India and Pakistan. Inevitably, what happened? The Pakistan army realized what this committee was doing. They caught on to them. Okay, so you are going to incentivize what are the assets that Pakistan army holds so that we cannot create whatever the adverse events that we are creating in Pakistan. So the Pakistan army realized the idea of this committee that was set up by the UPA government, and they cancelled the idea in the bud itself. Imagine if the committee proposal was agreed by both the sides. India was ready to agree to that proposal. To a certain extent, the Pakistan government at that time was also very much interested. But the army, which we were trying to incentivize to have a normal relationship between both the countries, did not agree to do that. So that is how trade with Pakistan has been. It has always been meddled. But understand this, we are neighbors and there is a lot of financial profits to be made, not in terms of money, but in terms of growth from the both countries trading in an equitable manner. Pakistan economy is in ruins right now. Despite banning trade with India, they imported 218 million worth of products from India, knowing that both are having differences of opinion in whatnot. Though the number seems to be very insignificant in terms of what India trades with other countries, including Bangladesh, when you take a closer look at trade data, India almost exports close to 360 products and Pakistan imports to Pakistan, and from Pakistan we import 25 products from that country. This, to remind you, despite having a complete ban on trade by Pakistan on both exports and imports, and we imposing a 200% hike on imports from Pakistan. So it is high time both the countries need to recognize what is at stake here and the cost that Pakistan imposing on itself by way of non-cooperation in terms of economic trade with India. For us, we have been very clear. We have only one agenda. One is stop exporting terror into our country. We'll give you whatever you want. We'll even help you with infrastructure. That has been the stand of Indian government. Though they don't say it officially, trust me, when they do back channel negotiations or diplomatic negotiations, or somebody is negotiating for somebody in the back channels in terms of Indo-Pakistan relation, India has been always shouting out on the roof from the rooftop, stating that please stop the terror export that you are doing into India. Stop financing terror activities. Stop financing illegal activities. Stop laundering money. Stop devaluing Indian money. Stop the illegal activities. We will go out of our way to help you recover economically. But the Pakistan government decides what the Pakistan government decides, and they are still in debt of 1 trillion or 1 billion or whatever the number to the Chinese. They are asking for the Saudi money, that the money isn't coming. What happened recently? The government asked for a loan from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia gave bags of rice to Pakistan. So we have enough data suggesting that having a positive or a green trade with Pakistan, both ways, India and Pakistan to India, is an economic cooperation that will reap benefits for both the country, particularly in the case of Pakistan. But for whatever reason, they are kicking it aside. Moving on to the next article. UP government focuses on testing in rural areas. In yesterday's class, I was a little bit of critical of UP government's actions. But now it seems that the UP government had taken or is doing a course correction in terms of how they treat or how they handle the spread of coronavirus in rural areas. As far as few days ago, the Uttar Pradesh government had constituted a committee that will ensure that they are going to do door-to-door collection of data in terms of COVID-19 cases. Complementing to that, the government has clearly said that the Uttar Pradesh government has clearly said that they are going to focus on testing of COVID-19 cases in rural areas and try to arrest the spread of virus in villages, and this is a positive step. As far as the promise is concerned, they have tested almost all 3 lakh samples in the last 24 hours alone, and they have already said that the recovery rate has gone up to 91.4%, with an active cases being reduced from 2 to 3 lakhs to 1.23 lakh. They have also said that they have distributed around 20 lakh medicine kits across districts in last 3 days, and they have been working with UP police to carry out 24-hour patrols of rivers to prevent people from disposing of bodies. If you have been following news, there has been a lot of chatter about the fact that people are discovering dead bodies floating in rivers in Uttar Pradesh. The high courts also have taken sumoto cases regarding this, but to allay all the fears, the state government went a step ahead and said that we are going to conduct patrolling of these rivers 24/7 to prevent such things from happening in the future. But coming back to the concept of the spread of coronavirus in rural areas, it is evident right now that the Uttar Pradesh government is far ahead of other states. So this is a positive development. That is what I wanted to bring during this article. Coming to the next article, UNESCO heritage sites. 6 UNESCO heritage sites were added in India. So how is this significant? So there is a lot of doom and gloom that is going around the world due to coronavirus pandemic, and I found it very positive to see that few sites that are so significant in terms of Indian history have been added as heritage sites by UNESCO. Now, what are the 6 sites that were added to the heritage sites of UNESCO? One is the Ganga Ghats in Varanasi. Second is the Temple of Kanchipuram, and the Satpura Tiger Reserve in Madhya Pradesh have been added to India's tentative list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So, 6 of the 9 sites submitted. So the government submitted 9 sites for this honor, out of which 6 were selected. So this is just to remember that there are still good things that are going on around the world. We have to wait for a few more days to come out of this pandemic. Moving to the next article, DD International to present India story. So this is a positive step towards building a narrative that is positive towards India. Almost every country in the world has their own news channel to present their side of the story. The Russian government has RT, the Chinese government has CGTN, the Americans have CNN, the British have BBC, Qatar has Al Jazeera. So all these countries have a news channel, an English news channel, English speaking news channel, that they use it as a tool in international diplomacy. They use it as a tool to disseminate information that they want to reach to the world. Till today, India doesn't have a specific channel to put forward its say or its side of the story. Now, the state broadcaster, that is Doordarshan, is planning to set up a new channel, DD International, to project India's point of view to the world. No matter how you look at it, no matter whatever the differences that you hold, this is a positive step in presenting a picture that India wants to present to the world. Now, as far as this, Doordarshan has floated an expression of interest, seeking applications for consultation service to provide a detailed project report for establishing of the channel. And as per the EOI document, the idea is to build a global presence for Doordarshan and establish an international voice for India. Remember this, if successful, if they do it rightly, if they do it honestly and rightly, this will have a far-reaching and better impact on India's image at the world stage. Thank you. Stay safe. Namaste.
বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা।
বৰঠাকুৰ IAS একাডেমি।